I arrived late to my son's wedding, my hands trembling as I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the ceremony venue. The flight from Phoenix had been delayed 3 hours, and I'd missed the vows entirely. Everyone was laughing and dancing in the reception hall, champagne flutes catching the amber glow of Edison bulbs strung across the exposed brick walls. My heart pounded as I smoothed my emerald dress, the one I'd spent 2 months searching for because Daniel had mentioned his fiancée loved jewel tones. Then I heard it, clear as a bell over the music. My daughter-in-law's voice, bright with relief. Thank God she didn't come. The words struck like ice water. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching her spin in her ivory gown, Daniel's arm around her waist. They hadn't seen me yet. My chest tightened, 69 years of living suddenly weighing on my shoulders like stones. But I stayed silent, stepping back into the shadows of the foyer, because something in her tone told me there was more to this story. If you're watching from anywhere in America, drop your state below and subscribe. I'll need all the support I can get for what happened next. The wedding coordinator rushed past me holding a silver tray of canapés, nearly knocking my purse from my shoulder. I pressed myself against the exposed brick wall, my breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with my recent hurry through the airport. Through the archway, I could see my son, my Daniel, who I'd raised alone after his father walked out when he was 3, dancing with a woman I'd never met in person, Melissa. They'd dated for only 8 months before announcing their engagement, and I'd been so thrilled that my only child had found love that I'd offered to help pay for the wedding. $25,000 from my retirement savings. Daniel had cried when I wrote the check, hugging me tight in my little kitchen back in Scottsdale. But now, watching Melissa laugh with her bridesmaids, all of them whispering and glancing toward the empty chair marked Mother of the Groom, I realized I might have made the biggest mistake of my life. The pearl bracelet on my wrist, Daniel's last birthday gift to me, suddenly felt like a shackle. I knew I should turn around and leave, call an Uber back to the airport hotel and fly home in the morning with whatever dignity I had left. But my feet wouldn't move. A lifetime of teaching middle school English had taught me that the whole story matters, that jumping to conclusions based on a single sentence was a mistake I'd corrected in countless student essays. So I stayed in that shadowy corner near the coat check, watching my son's wedding reception unfold without me. A small table near the kitchen doors had been abandoned by the catering staff, and I slipped into the chair, partially hidden by a decorative column wrapped in white roses and ivy. From here I could observe everything. Melissa's mother, a tall woman in a purple gown, was holding court near the cake table, gesturing animatedly. Daniel's best man was giving a toast, his words lost in the music and laughter. And my son, my beautiful boy with his father's dark eyes and my stubborn chin, looked happier than I'd ever seen him. That should have brought me joy. Instead, it carved out something hollow in my chest. The DJ announced the mother-son dance, and I watched Daniel's face fall just slightly before he recovered, smiling and shaking his head. He said something to the DJ, who nodded and transitioned smoothly into another upbeat song. The moment passed so quickly that most guests probably didn't notice, but I did. I noticed everything about my son, the way he tugged his left ear when he was nervous, how he always rolled his shoulders back before making a difficult decision. He did both now, turning to Melissa and pulling her close as the dance floor filled again. An older gentleman in a navy suit approached my table, squinting at me in the dim light. "Are you supposed to be here?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the authority of someone checking credentials. I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it. Was I supposed to be here? My invitation had said 6 o'clock for the ceremony, 7:30 for cocktails. It was now 8:45, according to the antique clock on the mantel. Technically, I was still invited. Emotionally, apparently not. I pulled my phone from my clutch purse and showed him my digital invitation, the one Daniel had sent 3 months ago with a photo of him and Melissa at sunset on a beach, both of them grinning. The older man, perhaps Melissa's father, based on the way he carried himself, studied it briefly, then nodded. "My apologies. I'm just making sure we don't have any wedding crashers. You'd be surprised how often it happens at venues like this." He gestured toward the bar. "Can I get you a drink? You look like you've had a rough evening." I managed a small smile, my throat tight. "Just some water, thank you." He disappeared toward the bar, and I was left alone again with my thoughts and my hurt. The thing was, I'd never been the interfering type of mother. When Daniel decided to move to Portland for college instead of staying in Arizona, I'd helped him pack. When he changed his major from engineering to graphic design, I'd supported him even though it meant less financial stability. When he called to say he'd met someone and she was the one, I'd been genuinely happy for him, even though it had only been their third date. So why would Melissa be relieved that I hadn't come? I replayed every phone conversation, every text exchange, searching for a clue I'd missed. There was the time I'd suggested they wait a year before getting married, not because I disapproved, but because I believed knowing someone through all 4 seasons was wise. Melissa had gone quiet on the phone, and Daniel had quickly changed the subject. There was the bridal shower I'd offered to host, which Melissa's mother had politely declined, saying they'd already made arrangements. And there was the dress-fitting incident. I'd flown out to Portland 2 months ago, and Melissa's mother had been the one standing on the platform with her while I sat alone on the boutique's velvet sofa, feeling like a visitor rather than family. Each memory clicked into place like puzzle pieces, forming a picture I'd been too optimistic to see. The older man returned with my water in a crystal glass, setting it on the table with a cocktail napkin. "I'm William, by the way, father of the bride. You must be Daniel's aunt?" He mentioned some family was traveling from out of state. I took a sip of water to buy myself time, the cold liquid doing nothing to ease the burning in my throat. "Something like that," I said, because claiming my title as mother of the groom seemed like it might cause a scene, and despite everything, I didn't want to ruin Daniel's night. William settled into the chair across from me, loosening his tie. Beautiful ceremony, wasn't it? Melissa looked like a princess. "We're so grateful Daniel's mother couldn't make it. Between you and me, Melissa was terrified the woman would try to make it all about her. You know how some mothers can be with their sons." He said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, that it took me a moment to process the words. My hands clenched around the glass. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. William laughed, clearly thinking he was speaking to a sympathetic audience. "Oh, Daniel told us all about it. Apparently his mother has been sick for months, some kind of heart condition. She called him last week and said she was too ill to travel." The wedding venue suddenly felt airless. The Edison bulbs too bright, the music too loud. My heart condition. The phrase echoed in my mind, bouncing off the confusion and hurt until it landed somewhere close to understanding. I set my water glass down carefully, afraid I might drop it otherwise. "I see," I managed. William nodded, warming to his topic. Poor woman, really. Daniel felt terrible about it, but Melissa was honestly relieved. She didn't want to say it outright, but she's been worried for months that his mother would try to control the wedding. Apparently she's quite difficult, very set in her ways, always offering unsolicited advice, that sort of thing. Each word was a small cut, precise and deep. I'd called Daniel last week, yes, but only to confirm my flight times and ask if he needed me to bring anything from Arizona. He'd sounded distracted, said everything was under control, told me he'd see me at the ceremony. No mention of canceling, no mention of being sick. The heart condition was real. I'd been diagnosed with premature ventricular contractions 2 years ago, but it was managed with medication, and my cardiologist had cleared me for travel. I should have stood up right then, walked across that polished concrete floor, and announced myself. But something held me back. Maybe pride. Maybe the sick curiosity of wanting to hear exactly what lies my son had told about me. William was still talking, his voice full of paternal satisfaction. "Melissa's been through enough with her first engagement, you know. That fell apart because the guy's mother wouldn't accept her. This time, we wanted everything to be perfect, and Daniel understood. He's such a good man, putting his bride's peace of mind first. Even sent his mother flowers and a lovely note explaining that it was better if she stayed home and rested. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. Flowers and a note. I'd received neither. My doorstep in Scottsdale had been empty, except for the usual grocery store circulars and a catalog from a garden supply company. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling through my text messages with Daniel. The last one was from 5 days ago. His response to my question about whether the venue was wheelchair accessible for his grandmother. "Yes, all set. See you Saturday, Mom. Love you." William's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, then stood up. "Duty calls. Apparently, we're about to cut the cake. Lovely talking with you. Enjoy the rest of the reception." He disappeared into the crowd, leaving me alone with the poisonous knowledge that my son had lied to his wife about me, had lied to his new in-laws, had lied to everyone. And the worst part, the part that made my chest actually ache, was that I didn't know why. I'd been a good mother, or at least I'd tried my best. Single parenthood had been brutal in ways I'd never expected. Working 2 jobs through Daniel's childhood, missing some of his school events because I had to cover extra shifts to keep us in our small apartment. But I'd made it to every important milestone, cheered at every graduation, helped with every science project at midnight. I thought we were close. I thought I'd raised a man who told the truth. Clearly, I'd been wrong about at least one of those things. The cake-cutting ceremony began, and I watched from my shadowed corner as Melissa fed Daniel a bite of what looked like lemon cake with raspberry filling, both of them laughing as cameras flashed. They looked so young, so happy, so certain of their future together. 29 years old, both of them, with their whole lives ahead. I remembered being that age, pregnant and alone, Daniel's father already gone, working as a substitute teacher and wondering how I'd ever manage. But I had managed, through sheer determination and coffee and the bone-deep love you feel for your child that surprises you with its intensity every single day. And this was how it ended, with me hiding at my own son's wedding, discovering that I'd been erased from the narrative of his life. The symbolic weight of that moment pressed down on me. I'd worn my grandmother's cameo brooch tonight, pinned to my dress just above my heart. She'd given it to me on my wedding day, and I'd planned to give it to Daniel tonight, to pass on to Melissa as a family heirloom. It sat in a small velvet box in my purse, suddenly meaningless. A bridesmaid approached the abandoned table, scooping up some discarded napkins and champagne flutes. She glanced at me with mild curiosity, probably wondering who I was and why I looked like I was about to cry at such a joyous occasion. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice kind. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without my voice breaking. She hesitated, then said, "The bathrooms are down that hall if you need a minute." I took her suggestion, standing on legs that felt unsteady and making my way through the crowd toward the restroom. In the mirror, I looked every one of my 69 years, the lines around my eyes deeper than I remembered, my carefully applied makeup unable to hide the pallor of shock. My hair, still more auburn than gray thanks to my hairdresser's skillful work, was coming loose from its updo. I looked like what I was, a woman who just had the ground shift beneath her feet and was struggling to stay upright. The bathroom door swung open, and 2 women entered, laughing. I recognized them from the ceremony photos Daniel had sent months ago, Melissa's college roommate and her cousin. They were talking as they fixed their makeup, apparently not noticing me in the corner stall. "I still can't believe Daniel actually told his mother not to come," the roommate said, reapplying lipstick. "That's so cold." The cousin laughed, a sharp sound that made me flinch. "Are you kidding? After everything Melissa went through with Brandon's family, can you blame her?" She told Daniel straight out that she wouldn't marry him unless he set boundaries with his mother. He had to choose, and he chose his wife. That's how it should be. My hand gripped the sink counter, knuckles white. "But from what Melissa told me, his mom didn't even do anything that bad," the roommate continued. "She just offered to help pay for the wedding and had some opinions about the venue. That's like normal mother of the groom stuff." The cousin shrugged, adjusting her dress. "Melissa sees it as controlling. She wants to start fresh, no baggage from either side. And honestly, after hearing about how Daniel's mom raised him, always making him feel guilty, always playing the martyr about being a single parent, I get it." I felt like I'd been punched. Playing the martyr. The words ricocheted around my skull, finding every insecure place I'd ever had about my parenting and lodging there like shrapnel. Had I done that? Had I made Daniel feel guilty without realizing it? I'd tried so hard not to burden him with my struggles, but maybe in trying to show him how much I'd sacrificed, I'd inadvertently made him feel responsible for my choices. The roommate sighed. "I don't know. It seems harsh, but whatever, it's their marriage. At least the wedding is beautiful, and did you see that cake? 4 tiers of amazing." They left, their laughter fading down the hallway, and I stood alone in the fluorescent bathroom light, staring at my reflection and seeing a stranger. A woman who'd apparently been so overbearing, so martyrish, so problematic, that her only child had lied to keep her away from the most important day of his life. A woman who'd given $25,000 to fund a wedding she wasn't wanted at. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt so much. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and opened my banking app. The check had cleared 3 weeks ago, deposited into the account Daniel had given me. $25,000, nearly a third of my retirement savings. Money I'd been setting aside for emergencies, or maybe a trip to Italy I'd always dreamed about. Money that was supposed to represent my love and support for my son's new beginning. Instead, it had bought me nothing but lies and exclusion. I thought about all the extra shifts I'd worked at the Phoenix Central Library over the past 2 years. My part-time job after retiring from teaching. Every Saturday, every Sunday, shelving books and helping patrons, telling myself it was worth it because I wanted to help my son start his marriage without debt. And he'd taken the money gladly while telling his fiancée and her family that I was too sick and too difficult to include. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, the sound drilling into my skull. I needed to decide what to do. I could confront them now, cause a scene, demand answers and apologies. Or I could leave quietly, go back to my hotel, fly home tomorrow, and cut my losses. But then, I remembered something Daniel used to say when he was a teenager, whenever he got caught in a lie. "I'm sorry, Mom. I just didn't want to disappoint you." And I'd always forgiven him because he was my son, because I loved him, because I believed people deserved second chances. Maybe this was just another version of that same fear. He'd wanted to make Melissa happy, wanted to avoid conflict, and had chosen the path of least resistance, even if it meant lying to everyone involved. Maybe if I just talked to him calmly, explained how much this hurt, we could work through it like we'd worked through everything else. I splashed cold water on my face, careful not to smudge my mascara further, and practiced what I might say. "Daniel, I need to talk to you. I came to the wedding, and I heard some things that confused me." Calm, reasonable, giving him a chance to explain. That's what a good mother would do, right? Not make a scene, not ruin his special day, but also not let this slide without discussion. I dried my hands, straightened my shoulders, and walked back out into the reception hall. The party was in full swing now, the DJ playing something upbeat that had most of the guests on the dance floor. I scanned the crowd for Daniel and found him near the bar, talking with his best man and laughing at something. He looked so much like his father in that moment, the same easy smile, the same way of throwing his head back when something genuinely amused him. His father, who'd also been good at lying, who'd promised forever and delivered 6 years. Maybe dishonesty was inherited, or maybe I'd just been unlucky in love and foolish in trust. I started to make my way toward Daniel, threading through the dancing guests, when Melissa suddenly appeared at my elbow. Up close, she was even more beautiful than in her photos. Porcelain skin, dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon, eyes that were currently widening in something between recognition and panic. "Oh my God," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You're Daniel's mother. What are you doing here? He said you were sick." The music seemed to swell around us, making the moment feel surreal, like we were in a movie rather than real life. I met her gaze, trying to keep my voice steady and kind despite everything. "I'm not sick, Melissa. My doctor cleared me to travel weeks ago. I flew in this morning and my flight was delayed. I arrived late, but I'm here." Her face went through a series of expressions. Shock, anger, something that might have been fear. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so petite, and steered me away from the main party toward a small alcove near the venue's kitchen entrance. "You need to leave," she hissed. "Right now. Daniel told you not to come. This is my wedding day, and I won't have you here trying to manipulate him." The accusation stung worse than anything else so far. "Manipulate him? Melissa, I'm his mother. I helped pay for this wedding. I love my son, and I would never do anything to hurt him." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's exactly what a manipulative person would say. "Look, I know all about women like you. My ex-fiancé's mother was the same way. Always playing the victim, always making everything about her, always trying to control her son's life." I took a step back, needing physical space from the venom in her words. "I don't know what Daniel told you about me, but I'm not that person. I've never tried to control him. I supported every decision he ever made, even when it cost me. Melissa crossed her arms, her wedding dress rustling. Really? So you didn't offer to pay for the wedding on the condition that you got to help plan it? You didn't call Daniel crying 3 times a week about how lonely you were after he moved to Portland? You didn't tell him that you'd have to work until you were 80 because you'd spent all your money raising him? Each accusation landed like a physical blow because they were distortions of truth, twisted versions of real moments that had been stripped of context and repackaged as evidence of my guilt. Yes, I'd offered to help pay for the wedding and had naturally assumed I'd be involved in some planning. Yes, I'd called Daniel regularly, and yes, sometimes I was lonely, but I'd never meant to make him feel responsible for my emotional state. And yes, I'd mentioned once, casually, that I'd probably work part-time for a few more years, but it had been a simple statement of fact, not a guilt trip. Those things aren't what you're making them sound like, I said, fighting to keep my voice from shaking. I think there's been a massive misunderstanding here. But Melissa wasn't listening. The only misunderstanding is you thinking you're welcome here. Daniel made his choice. He chose me, his wife, over you. And if you had any decency, you'd respect that choice and leave. She turned to walk away, her train sweeping behind her in a rustle of silk and tulle. I stood there in that alcove, the sounds of celebration echoing from the main hall, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding or hurt feelings anymore. This was about my son, a man I'd raised to be honest, kind, and strong, lying to his wife about me, lying to me by omission, and apparently being okay with the result, as long as his wedding day went smoothly. And suddenly, the hurt began to crystallize into something harder, something closer to anger. I'd been taught my whole life to be accommodating, to smooth things over, to prioritize other people's comfort. But there's a limit to grace, and I'd found mine. I walked back toward the main hall, but instead of approaching Daniel, I made my way to the wedding coordinator, a harried-looking woman with a clipboard and a headset. "Excuse me," I said, my voice remarkably calm given the storm inside me. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell, the mother of the groom. I need to speak with the venue manager about the payment for this event." The coordinator's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, Mrs. Hartwell. I thought, well, we were told you couldn't make it. Is everything all right?" I smiled, a tight, controlled expression. "Everything is fine, but I do need to speak with the manager. It's regarding the final payment arrangements." She hesitated, clearly sensing trouble but probably not wanting to get involved. "Let me find him for you. Just wait here a moment." She scurried off, speaking urgently into her headset, and I stood there with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do, but I knew I needed to understand the full picture before I made any decisions. Had Daniel used my money and then lied about it? Or was there something else going on here? The venue manager appeared a few minutes later, a tall man in a dark suit with silver-threaded hair and a professional smile. "Mrs. Hartwell? I'm Thomas Brennan, the manager here at the Ironworks. How can I help you?" I shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip, the way he held eye contact. "I contributed to the payment for this event, and I'd like to verify that all the charges have been settled properly. Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" His smile flickered slightly, but he nodded. "Of course. Follow me." He led me to a small office off the main corridor, closing the door behind us to muffle the music and chatter. Inside, he moved behind a desk, tapping at a computer keyboard. "Let me pull up the account. The Whitmore-Hartwell wedding, correct?" I nodded, standing because sitting felt like surrender. Thomas scrolled through what I assumed were payment records, his expression neutral. "All right, I have it here. The total cost for the venue, catering, bar service, and decorations came to $48,700. We received a deposit of $12,000 4 months ago, and the final balance of $36,700 was paid 2 weeks ago." The numbers didn't make sense. I'd given Daniel $25,000 specifically for the wedding. "Can you tell me how those payments were made?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Thomas checked his screen again. The initial deposit was made by William Whitmore via wire transfer. The final payment was also from William Whitmore. Same method. So Daniel hadn't used my money for the venue at all, which meant either he'd spent it on other wedding expenses or he'd pocketed it entirely. The anger that had been building began to surge, hot and righteous. "Thank you for that information," I said. "One more question. Is the venue payment contract in my son's name?" Thomas nodded. "It's listed under Daniel Hartwell and Melissa Whitmore, yes. They're both legally responsible for the balance, but since it's paid in full, there shouldn't be any issues." I thanked him and left the office, my mind racing through possibilities and implications. $25,000, gone, used for something other than what I'd been told. And still, my son had lied to keep me away from his wedding, painting me as the villain in a story I hadn't even known I was in. I found a quiet corner near the venue's front entrance, away from the party, and called my friend Margaret, who'd been my confidant for 30 years. She answered on the second ring. "Ellie, how's the wedding? I want to hear everything." My voice cracked despite my best efforts. "Margaret, I need you to listen and tell me if I'm crazy." I laid out the whole situation. The overheard conversation, William's comments, the bathroom gossip, my confrontation with Melissa, and the payment revelation. Margaret was silent for a long moment after I finished. "Eleanor," she finally said, her voice tight with controlled fury, "you need to talk to Daniel right now. Not tomorrow, not when you get home. Right now. That boy owes you an explanation, and he needs to face what he's done." I wiped at my eyes, grateful for her anger on my behalf because it validated my own. "But it's his wedding night. I don't want to ruin it." Margaret made a disgusted sound. "He already ruined it when he lied to everyone. You didn't do this. He did. Now go get your answers." She was right, of course. I'd spent my entire life trying not to be a burden, not to cause trouble, not to make waves. But there comes a point when self-preservation and dignity require you to stand up, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. I ended the call, straightened my spine, and walked back into the reception hall with purpose. Daniel was now on the dance floor with Melissa, swaying to a slow song, his arms around her waist, her head on his shoulder. They looked like a magazine spread, like every wedding photo cliché come to life. I waited until the song ended, until the DJ announced a break, until the moment felt right, or at least less wrong than interrupting mid-dance. Then I walked across that floor, heels clicking on the concrete, and tapped my son on the shoulder. He turned, and the blood drained from his face when he saw me. "Mom?" he whispered, the word barely audible over the ambient noise. "What are you doing here? You said you couldn't come." The lie was so smooth, so automatic, that I almost admired the skill of it, even as it broke something in me. "No, Daniel," I said quietly, aware that people were starting to notice us, starting to turn and stare. "You told me 6 o'clock at the ironworks, and that's where I am. What I want to know is why you told your wife and her family that I was too sick to travel, and why you told them I was a controlling, manipulative burden you needed to set boundaries with." His face went from pale to red, a flush creeping up his neck. Melissa materialized at his side, her earlier venom replaced with something like fear. "Daniel, make her leave," she said urgently. "You promised me she wouldn't be here. You promised." The DJ, sensing drama, had stopped the music entirely. The entire reception hall was watching us now, 200 guests riveted by the spectacle of family dysfunction playing out in real time. I should have felt embarrassed. Instead, I felt weirdly calm, like I'd finally stopped swimming against the current and was just letting the river take me. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Mom, it's complicated. Can we please talk about this later? This is my wedding." I nodded slowly. "Yes, it is. The wedding I helped pay for with $25,000 from my retirement savings." A murmur rippled through the crowd. William Whitmore pushed his way toward us, his earlier friendliness replaced with confusion. "What's going on here? Daniel, you said your mother was too ill to attend?" Daniel's face was now a mask of panic and guilt. "She was. I thought—" I cut him off, my voice still calm but carrying across the silent room. "I'm not ill, William. My cardiologist cleared me for travel weeks ago. I arrived late because my flight was delayed, but I've been here for the past 45 minutes, listening to people tell me what a terrible mother I apparently am." I turned to Daniel, and for the first time in his 29 years, I looked at him without the softening filter of maternal love. "Why did you lie to me, Daniel? Why did you take my money and then tell everyone I wasn't coming? What did I do that was so terrible you had to erase me from your wedding? He looked trapped, his eyes darting between me and Melissa, and I could see him calculating what to say, how to fix this. Always the problem solver, my son, always looking for the easy way out. Mom, I didn't lie. Melissa was stressed, and her family was worried about drama, and I thought it would be easier if... The words tumbled out fast, incomplete, damning in their honesty. Easier. It would be easier to exclude his mother than to stand up to his fiancée. Easier to take my money and lie about my attendance than to navigate the complicated dynamics of blending families. I felt something in my chest crack open. Not break, exactly, but fundamentally change shape. Easier for whom? I asked softly. Not for me, certainly. I spent 2 months looking for the perfect dress because you said Melissa loved jewel tones. I worked extra shifts at the library to give you money for your wedding. I told everyone at my retirement community about how excited I was to dance with my son. And you made me disappear because it was easier. Melissa grabbed Daniel's arm, her voice shrill. This is exactly what I was afraid of. She's making everything about her, playing the victim, trying to manipulate you with guilt. Daniel, you need to ask her to leave right now, or our marriage starts with you choosing her over me. The ultimatum hung in the air like poison gas. I watched my son's face, waiting to see what he would choose, and in that moment I realized with crystal clarity that it didn't matter. Whether he chose her or chose me, the relationship we'd had, the closeness I'd thought we shared, was already gone, killed by months of lies and the fundamental truth that he'd been willing to hurt me to make his life easier. Don't, I said before he could speak. Don't choose Daniel. I'm going to make this very easy for you. I pulled the velvet box with my grandmother's cameo from my purse, the one I'd planned to give them as a family heirloom, and set it on the nearest table. This was going to be my wedding gift to you both, but I think it should stay with people who value family history and honesty. Then I turned to William Whitmore, who was watching with an expression somewhere between shock and discomfort. William, I'd like to discuss the matter of my wedding contribution. $25,000 that, according to your venue manager, was not used to pay for this reception. I'll be contacting my lawyer to look into the matter. The threat of legal action rippled through the room. Daniel's face went ashen. Mom, please, we can explain. The money went to other things, my student loans, the honeymoon, some furniture for the apartment. So you lied about what you needed it for, I said, and it wasn't a question. You told me it was for the wedding venue, and I wrote the check because I trusted you. That's called fraud, Daniel. And while I don't know if I'll pursue it legally, I absolutely will pursue it morally. I turned to address the room, all those guests who'd been told I was too sick and too difficult to attend. I apologize for disrupting this celebration, but I want everyone here to know that I am not sick, I am not manipulative, and I am not the villain in this story. I'm just a mother who loved her son and got lied to for her trouble. The silence was deafening. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, someone started clapping slowly. I turned to see an older woman I didn't recognize, maybe in her 70s, standing with her hands coming together in measured applause. Good for you, she called out. I'm Melissa's grandmother, and I'm disgusted by what I've just heard. Other people began to murmur, conversations breaking out across the room like brush fire. I could see the tide turning, could see people looking at Daniel and Melissa with questions in their eyes instead of congratulations. But I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I'd said what I needed to say, and now I needed to leave before the adrenaline wore off and the crushing weight of loss hit me. I walked out of the ironworks with my head high, my emerald dress swishing around my knees, and got into an Uber I'd ordered on my phone during Daniel's stammered explanations. The driver asked if I'd had a good time at the wedding. I laughed, a sound that bordered on hysteria. It was unforgettable, I told him, and it was the truest thing I'd said all night. Back at my hotel, I ordered room service, a cheeseburger and a glass of wine, and sat by the window overlooking downtown Portland, trying to process what had happened. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from Daniel, from Melissa, from William, all of them demanding explanations or offering justifications. I turned it off and ate my burger in silence. The next morning, I woke to 73 missed calls and 46 text messages. I'd turned my phone back on briefly to set an alarm, and the notifications had flooded in overnight. Most were from Daniel, progressing from angry to defensive to pleading. "Mom, you embarrassed me in front of everyone. You always do this. Make everything about you. Fine, I'm sorry, but you could have waited until after the wedding to talk to me. Please call me back. Melissa's family is furious, and her grandmother is saying terrible things." I deleted them without responding and checked my email instead. There was one from my lawyer, Karen Rothstein, who I'd contacted late last night in a moment of determined clarity. "Eleanor, got your message. Call me when you're awake. We need to discuss your options regarding the $25,000. This situation is more complex than a simple gift, especially given the misrepresentation involved. Also, I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." I smiled at that last sentence, feeling a warmth that had been absent since I'd arrived at the wedding. I called her from the hotel room, and we spent 40 minutes going over the details. Karen explained that while gifts to adult children were generally not recoverable, the fact that Daniel had specifically requested the money for wedding expenses and then used it for other purposes without my knowledge created a potential fraud claim. "More importantly," she said, "it gave me leverage." "You don't have to sue him, Ellie," Karen said, her voice pragmatic and kind. "But you can make it clear that you expect repayment on reasonable terms, and that if he refuses, you'll explore legal options. Sometimes just knowing there are consequences makes people more willing to make things right." I considered this while watching the morning sun paint the Portland skyline in shades of gold and amber. Did I want to sue my own son? The question made my stomach churn. But did I want to let him get away with lying to me and stealing from me? Because that's what it was, really. Theft by deception? That question had a clearer answer. "I want to send him a formal letter," I told Karen. "Something that outlines what happened, what I expect in terms of repayment, and what the consequences will be if he refuses. Not because I want to punish him, but because I need him to understand that his actions have real implications." Karen agreed and said she'd draft something by the end of the week. We hung up, and I sat in the silence of my hotel room, feeling the weight of everything shift and resettle. This wasn't how I'd imagined my son's wedding going. I'd pictured dancing with him, welcoming Melissa into our family, maybe giving a toast about how proud I was. Instead, I'd exposed lies in front of 200 people and was now consulting lawyers about fraud. The loss felt enormous, like a death without a body to mourn. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was a number I didn't recognize with a Portland area code. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is Catherine Whitmore, Melissa's grandmother. We spoke briefly last night, though I doubt you remember given the circumstances." Her voice was cultured, precise, with the faint trace of an accent I couldn't quite place. "I remember," I said cautiously. "You were kind to speak up." She made a thoughtful sound. "I wanted to apologize on behalf of my family for the appalling way you were treated. I had no idea the situation was as it was until you revealed it. I'd been told you were gravely ill and had encouraged Melissa and Daniel to send flowers and well wishes. Discovering that my granddaughter participated in such a deception has been deeply upsetting." Something in my chest loosened slightly at her words. "Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Whitmore. It means more than you know," she continued, her voice firmer now. "I also wanted you to know that I've spoken with my son William this morning, and we've agreed to withdraw our financial support for the honeymoon trip to Bali. That's $12,000 that will not be going toward rewarding behavior we find reprehensible." I felt a spike of guilt at that. I hadn't wanted to cause financial consequences for Daniel beyond recovering my own money. But Catherine spoke again before I could protest. "Please don't feel badly about this, Eleanor. May I call you Eleanor?" I murmured agreement, and she went on. "My granddaughter needs to learn that actions have consequences and that you cannot build a marriage on lies and exclusion. I raised William to be better than this, and I'm horrified that Melissa thought such behavior was acceptable. She's been through difficulties with her previous engagement, yes, but that doesn't give her license to demonize every mother-in-law she encounters." We talked for another 20 minutes, Catherine sharing her own experiences as a mother-in-law and mother to adult children, and by the end, I felt less alone than I had since arriving in Portland. She gave me her personal number and made me promise to stay in touch. "You seem like the kind of woman I'd like to know better," she said. "Perhaps we can turn this disaster into something positive." A friendship, at least. After we hung up, I packed my suitcase and prepared to check out. My return flight wasn't until 7 that evening, which left me with a full day in Portland. I could have stayed in my hotel room, nursing my wounds and refreshing my phone for updates. Instead, I decided to do something I'd wanted to do since Daniel first moved here. Visit Powell's City of Books, the massive independent bookstore he'd told me about for years. I took the Max light rail downtown, watching Portland pass by through rain-spattered windows, and found Powell's occupying an entire city block. Inside, it was a maze of rooms painted different colors, each one stuffed floor to ceiling with books. I wandered through the blue room and the gold room and the rose room, breathing in that particular smell of paper and binding glue and possibility. In the orange room, in the poetry section, I found a slim volume by Mary Oliver and stood reading it in the aisle. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" The line hit me like a physical thing, and I bought the book immediately. Sitting in the Pearl Room Cafe with coffee and a scone, I opened my new book and tried to answer that question for myself. What did I plan to do with my life now? I was 69 years old, recently retired from teaching, with savings that had just taken a significant hit. My relationship with my only child was fractured, possibly beyond repair. I lived alone in a modest home in Arizona and had no immediate family besides Daniel. The future I'd imagined, one where I'd be a doting grandmother someday, where Sunday dinners would include my son and his growing family, now seemed impossible. But maybe impossible just meant different than planned. I thought about Catherine Whitmore's offer of friendship, about Karen Rothstein's quiet pride in me for standing up for myself, about Margaret's fierce loyalty. I thought about the library patrons who'd become friends, about my book club and my neighbors, and the life I'd actually built rather than the one I'd been waiting to have. Maybe my wild and precious life wasn't supposed to center around being a mother anymore. Maybe it was time to figure out who Eleanor Hartwell was when she wasn't defined by her relationship to her son. My phone buzzed with another call. Daniel again. This time, I answered. "Mom, finally. We need to talk about what you did last night." His voice was tight, angry, in a way I'd rarely heard. No apology, no acknowledgement of his own role, just immediate offense that I'd dared to expose his lies. "I'm listening," I said, my voice steady. He launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech. "You embarrassed me and Melissa in front of our friends and family. You made our wedding day about you and your feelings instead of being happy for us. Melissa's grandmother is now refusing to pay for our honeymoon, and her parents are questioning whether we rushed into marriage. All because you couldn't wait one day to have your dramatic confrontation." I let him finish, sipping my coffee, watching a young couple browse poetry books together near my table. "Daniel," I said, when he finally paused for breath, "did you lie to me about being welcome at your wedding?" Silence. Then, "It's complicated." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Did you take $25,000 from me under false pretenses and use it for purposes you never disclosed?" More silence. "I was going to tell you eventually." "That's not an answer," I said. "Yes or no? Did you lie about what you needed the money for?" I heard him sigh, heard the rustle of movement like he was pacing. "Yes, okay? Yes, I lied. But Mom, you have to understand." "No," I interrupted, and the word came out stronger than I'd intended. "I don't have to understand. You're 29 years old, Daniel. You're old enough to be married, which means you're old enough to be honest with the people who love you." His voice rose in frustration. "You don't get it. Melissa made it clear from the beginning that she wouldn't marry me if I didn't set boundaries with you. She said I needed to prove I could put her first, that I could stand up to you. I didn't know how else to do it without hurting you worse." The admission hung in the air between us. So this had been a test, a loyalty check that I'd failed by simply existing and wanting to be part of my son's life. "So, lying to me was the kind option?" I asked softly. "Taking my money and excluding me was setting boundaries?" Daniel's voice cracked slightly. "I thought if you just didn't come to the wedding, then afterwards we could all start fresh. Melissa would see that I chose her, and you wouldn't have to know that she didn't want you there. Everyone would be happy." The logic of it was so twisted, so fundamentally broken, that I didn't know where to begin unpacking it. "Daniel, I'm going to say this once, and I need you to really hear it. What you did, lying to me, stealing from me, allowing your wife and her family to believe terrible things about me. That wasn't love. That wasn't protecting anyone. That was cowardice dressed up as peacekeeping. And it's not something I can just forgive and move on from. I heard him inhale sharply. So what? You're cutting me off. You're going to stop being my mother because I made one mistake? The question was manipulative, designed to make me feel guilty for having boundaries of my own. Old Eleanor would have backed down immediately, would have reassured him that of course I'd always be his mother, that we could work through this. New Eleanor, the one who'd stood up in front of 200 strangers and demanded truth, had a different answer. I'll always be your mother, Daniel. That's biology. But whether we have a relationship beyond that is something you're going to have to earn back through consistent honesty and changed behavior. Right now, I don't trust you. And I can't have a relationship with someone I don't trust. I heard Melissa's voice in the background, sharp and insistent, though I couldn't make out the words. Daniel spoke away from the phone, his words muffled, then came back. Melissa says you're being manipulative. She says this is exactly the kind of behavior she was afraid of, you trying to control me through guilt and ultimatums. I laughed, and it felt good, cleansing in its bitterness. Daniel, I'm going to let you go now because I'm sitting in Powell's books drinking coffee and reading poetry, and I have better things to do than argue in circles. Your lawyer will be receiving a letter from my lawyer within the week regarding repayment of the $25,000. I suggest you take it seriously. His voice rose in panic. You're suing me. Mom, I'm your son. I gathered my things, dropping a tip on the table for the barista. Yes, you are, which is why I gave you that money in the first place. But being my son doesn't give you permission to lie to me and steal from me. Goodbye, Daniel. I hung up before he could respond and turned off my phone entirely. My hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline, but I felt oddly lighter, like I'd set down something heavy I'd been carrying for years without realizing it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of books and walking and thinking. I had lunch at a Vietnamese restaurant in the Pearl District, the PHO warm and restorative. I browsed a vintage shop and bought a silk scarf printed with birds that reminded me of my grandmother's garden. I sat in Director Park and watched people live their lives. Mothers with strollers, teenagers skateboarding, an elderly couple sharing an ice cream cone despite the drizzle. By the time I boarded my flight back to Phoenix, I felt settled in a way I hadn't in months. Not happy exactly, but clear. The flight attendant brought me a small bottle of wine, and I toasted myself quietly at 30,000 feet, watching the sun set over landscapes I couldn't name. The woman next to me, maybe 40 with kind eyes, asked if I was celebrating something. My independence, I told her, and we ended up talking the whole flight about mothers and sons, and the moment you realize your children are fully formed humans who might not be the people you'd hoped they'd be. Back home in Scottsdale, my house felt smaller than I remembered, but also more mine. I'd lived here for 15 years, ever since I'd saved enough for a down payment, but I'd always thought of it as temporary, a way station until Daniel got settled and I might move closer to him and his future family. Now I looked at it with fresh eyes, the garden I'd cultivated, the bookshelves I'd built, the kitchen where I'd perfected my grandmother's recipes. This was my place, and it didn't need to be temporary. Margaret came over the next morning with pastries and fierce hugs, and we sat on my back patio while I told her everything. She cried when I got to the part about Daniel's test of loyalty explanation, angry tears that matched my own. That boy needs a reality check, she said, biting into a croissant with more force than necessary. And that Melissa girl needs to learn that marriage isn't about erasing your partner's family. I agreed, but I also felt a strange sympathy for Melissa that I hadn't expected. She'd been hurt before, and she was trying to protect herself the only way she knew how. It was just unfortunate that her protection required my erasure, and that Daniel had been willing to facilitate it. Karen's letter arrived at Daniel's apartment via certified mail 3 days later. I knew because he called me immediately after signing for it. His voice panicked. Mom, you can't be serious about this. $25,000? I don't have that kind of money right now. I was in my garden, deadheading roses, and I didn't put down my pruning shears. The letter outlines a repayment plan, Daniel. $250 per month for 10 years. That's less than you'd pay for a decent car loan. The alternative is that I pursue fraud charges and civil recovery, which would be much more expensive for you in the long run." He sputtered, started several sentences, and abandoned them, finally landing on, "But I'm your son. You can't sue your own son." I snipped a dead bloom, the satisfaction of the clean cut surprisingly soothing. "Watch me," I said simply. "You have 30 days to respond to the letter with your first payment or a counterproposal. If I don't hear from you, my lawyer files the civil suit. It's that simple." Melissa grabbed the phone. I heard the scuffle, and her voice came through shrill and furious. "This is financial abuse. We're newlyweds trying to start our lives, and you're trying to bankrupt us." I took a breath, held it, released it slowly. "Melissa, I'm going to say this once. I gave that money to my son in good faith for a specific purpose. He lied about that purpose, and then lied about me to justify excluding me from his wedding. Those are facts, not feelings. If you think expecting repayment for money obtained through deception is financial abuse, then you need to reconsider your understanding of the word." I heard her gasp, heard Daniel saying something urgently in the background. "You know what?" Melissa said, her voice trembling with rage. "You can have your money, every penny, because it's not worth having someone like you in our lives. We'll send you a check for the full amount this week, and then you can leave us alone forever." Something twisted in my chest at that, the finality of it, the willingness to cut ties rather than admit fault. "If that's what you want," I said quietly. "But Melissa, someday you might have children, and someday they might disappoint you or make choices you don't understand. When that happens, I hope you remember this moment and have more grace than you're showing me now." I hung up before she could respond, my hands steady even though my heart was racing. The check arrived 6 days later, not from Daniel and Melissa, but from William and Catherine Whitmore, with a brief note on expensive stationery. "Eleanor, our grandson-in-law's behavior has shamed our family. Please accept this as repayment of your stolen funds. We've asked Daniel and Melissa to repay us directly, with interest. We hope you can find peace. Regards, William and Catherine Whitmore." The check was certified, made out for exactly $25,000. I stared at it for a long time, sitting at my kitchen table with afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to refuse the money because taking it felt like closing a door I wasn't sure I was ready to close. But another part of me, the part that was learning to honor my own worth, knew that accepting it was the right thing to do. I'd earned this money through years of work, and I deserved to have it back. I deposited the check that afternoon and called Karen to let her know the matter was settled. "They paid the whole thing at once?" she asked, surprise evident in her voice. "That's unusual. Most people in their situation would fight it or try to negotiate." I explained about the Whitmores, and Karen made a thoughtful sound. "Sounds like they have integrity at least. That's something." I agreed, then asked the question that had been nagging at me. "Karen, am I a terrible mother for pursuing this, for not just forgiving him and moving on?" She was quiet for a moment. "Ellie, you're one of the best people I know. You raised your son alone, worked yourself to exhaustion to give him opportunities, and supported him in everything. What you're asking for isn't punishment. It's accountability. And if he can't understand the difference, that's his failure, not yours." Her words settled over me like a blanket, warm and reassuring. We talked for a few more minutes about next steps. There weren't really any, since the matter was resolved. And then I hung up and stood in my kitchen, looking around at the life I'd built for myself. The calendar on my wall showed October 17th, 3 weeks since the wedding. In those 3 weeks, I'd confronted my son, demanded justice, gotten my money back, and somehow started to rebuild my sense of self. It felt like years had passed, like I'd aged and youngified simultaneously, shedding an old skin to reveal something tougher underneath. Margaret organized a divorce party for me 2 weeks later, even though I pointed out I hadn't actually divorced anyone. "You divorced the version of yourself that let people walk all over her," she said, setting up appetizers on my patio table. She'd invited 8 women from our book club and retirement community, all of them bringing wine and stories of their own battles for self-respect. We sat under string lights as the November evening cooled, and I felt held by their friendship in a way I hadn't experienced before. One woman, Rita, told about cutting off her daughter for 3 years after she'd stolen jewelry and pawned it for drug money. "Best thing I ever did," Rita said, refilling her wine glass. Because it forced her to hit bottom and get help. Sometimes love has to be tough to be real. Another woman, Janet, shared how she'd had to sue her ex-husband for decades of unpaid alimony. People called me vindictive, she said. But you know what? I'd worked just as hard in that marriage as he had in his career, and I deserved my share. There's nothing wrong with demanding what's rightfully yours. Their stories made me feel less alone in my decision, less like a terrible mother and more like a woman who'd simply drawn a necessary line. We toasted to boundaries and self-respect and second acts in life, and by the time everyone left, I felt genuinely hopeful about my future for the first time since the wedding. That night, lying in bed with the windows open to let in the desert air, I thought about Daniel and wondered what he was feeling. Shame? Anger? Regret? Or had he convinced himself that I was the villain, that I'd overreacted, that he'd been justified in his choices? I didn't know, and I was learning to accept that I might never know. You can't control how other people see you or the stories they tell themselves. All you can control is your own truth and whether you live it with integrity. My phone buzzed with an email notification, probably something from the library about my upcoming volunteer shift, but when I checked, it was from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "From Daniel's college friend." Curious, I opened it. "Mrs. Hartwell, you don't know me, but my name is Josh Martin. I went to Portland State with Daniel, and I was at his wedding. I wanted you to know that what you did took incredible courage, and I'm sorry for what you've been going through. I've watched Daniel change over the past year since he met Melissa, becoming more distant from his friends, more focused on pleasing her, more willing to bend his values to keep the peace. I tried to talk to him about it a few times, but he shut me down. After the wedding, after you left, several of us tried to convince him that he'd handled things badly. He refused to listen, and we've since stopped hanging out with him. I just wanted you to know that not everyone believed the story he was telling about you, and some of us saw the truth long before you revealed it. I hope you're doing okay. You deserved better from your son." I read the email 3 times, tears blurring the words on the screen. A stranger, someone who owed me nothing, had taken the time to reach out and validate my experience. It was such a small thing and such a huge thing simultaneously. I wrote back thanking him and asking if he'd be willing to tell me more about the changes he'd noticed in Daniel. Josh responded the next morning with a detailed account of how Daniel had gradually isolated himself from his friend group, how he'd started making excuses for Melissa's controlling behavior, how he'd seemed to lose himself in the relationship. "The Daniel I knew in college was confident and independent," Josh wrote. "The Daniel who got married seemed anxious and people-pleasing. It was hard to watch, honestly. Some of us wondered if it was a healthy relationship, but he seemed committed to making it work, no matter what." His words painted a picture I hadn't wanted to see. My son, trapped in a relationship that required him to become someone else. Someone smaller, someone willing to betray his own mother to prove his devotion. It made me sad for him in a way that the anger and hurt hadn't. He'd made terrible choices, yes, but maybe he'd made them from a place of desperation rather than malice. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it added context, nuance, the kind of complication that made forgiveness seem possible somewhere down the road, even if that road was long. Thanksgiving came and went, my first major holiday without Daniel in 29 years. Margaret invited me to her daughter's house, and I went, grateful for the inclusion and the distraction. We ate turkey and sweet potatoes and pumpkin pie, and I felt mostly fine until someone asked if I had children, and I had to navigate the complicated answer. "I have a son," I said carefully. "We're not in touch right now." The questioner, a well-meaning aunt of someone, pushed further. "Oh, that's so sad. What happened?" Margaret intervened smoothly, changing the subject, but the moment left me rattled. "How did you explain to strangers that your son had stolen from you and lied about you and then cut you off when you demanded accountability? You didn't really. You just smiled vaguely and said, 'It's complicated,' and changed the subject as quickly as possible." Later that night, alone in my living room with leftover pie and a glass of wine, I pulled out the box of photos I kept in the hall closet, decades of Daniel's life documented in prints that predated smartphones. Baby pictures, first day of school pictures, little league photos, high school graduation, college acceptance letters. So much joy, so much hope, so much love captured in moments that now felt distant and unfamiliar. I allowed myself to grieve that night in a way I hadn't since the wedding. I cried for the relationship that was gone, for the future I'd imagined that would never happen, for the grandmother I might never get to be. I cried for my younger self, the single mother who'd sacrificed so much and believed it would all be worth it because her son would grow up knowing he was loved. And I cried for Daniel, too, for whatever pain or fear had driven him to make the choices he'd made, for the man he could have been if he'd had the courage to stand up for truth instead of convenience. But when the tears finally stopped, I felt cleaner somehow, emptied out and ready to be filled with something new. I put the photos away and made myself a promise. I would not spend the rest of my life defined by this loss. I would not become bitter or closed off or afraid to trust. I would take this pain and transform it into wisdom, into compassion, into a deeper understanding of human fragility and the importance of self-respect. It was a tall order, but I was 69 years old and still capable of growth. That counted for something.